All right, so this is kind of a bit of a homecoming for me, being here. And I, back in the late 80s, I studied at Illinois State University. Initially, I was a graphic design student, and 1987, I went to study in Florence, Italy. And during that time, I traveled with a friend of mine up to Berlin, Munich, and then Berlin, and we saw some pretty amazing art exhibits at the Alt Pinakothek, the new Pinakothek in Munich, and then an art museum, I don't remember the name of it, in Berlin. So this was before the Berlin Wall came down. This is fall, winter of '87. And so that experience, being immersed in art in Florence, and then those experiences seeing this art in the real instead of seeing it on a slide presentation in an art history class, had a big impact on me. So when I returned right after Christmas in 1987, I decided I wanted to change from a graphic design student to an art student. So I enrolled in the BFA program at Illinois State University and went on to get my master's, and then transferred to University of Iowa and received my Master of Fine Arts degree there, 1993. And probably my experience in art school at Illinois State University, in particular with a few professors. I had Harold Boyd, Harold Greger, Ken Holder, Ron Jackson, Ray George, had a big impact on me and a big influence on the way I talked about art, really. And my experience in Europe also had a big influence over the way I looked at art, the way I talked about art, and the importance of understanding the history of art, whether it's Western or non-Western, when you are making art and when you're talking about art. Two big important things for me. And so after Iowa, I had been doing some scenery painting for the theater, and after I got my MFA degree, I've been painting houses ever since. I'm joking, but it's true. Been working as a decorative finishing contractor, mural painter for 25 years or whatever it is now. But so that experience in Iowa, learning a lot about scenery painting, decorative painting for theater, led to me going into that trade. And so I had to put away my paintbrushes for a while, and I focused on that business. And my wife got married, had kids, bought a house, and both of us worked together in that business. And so art was kind of put on hold for a while. So then I started getting back into it. One of my customers, he is also a writer. He wrote some children's books, and he needed an illustrator. So he asked me to do some illustrations for it. They didn't sell very well, but I got paid anyway, so that's all that mattered to me. And so then that led to me getting back into drawing and into watercolor, and which I hadn't done much before in the past. And so I started doing a lot of watercolor. This is like in 2010, 2011, so just 10 years ago. And so I hadn't been really doing any art other than decorative finishing and mural painting in a commercial. So I hadn't been doing much art, all right? And then got back into it after I started doing those illustrations for that customer of mine, and decided to join a local art co-op gallery in West Chicago. That's where we live. And joined that with about another 30 artists. Also joined a local arts commission in West Chicago, the West Chicago Cultural Arts Commission. Joined that. I've been on that commission ever since, so that's 10 years now. And so slowly I started getting back into making art. And one of the commission members, he resigned. He moved out to Arizona, and where he teaches at a Waldorf school. And he had a box of oil paints. And so he came by one day and he said, "Buddy, you want these oil paints?" And I said, "All right, I haven't painted for years." And so great. So I took them and took out some of my old paintings that I had never finished that were sitting in my garage, and started working on them. And it was like it was like going back in time. The smell of the linseed oil and just kind of woke all these feelings and memories up in my mind, and so I really got into it. So I went back to painting, back to making art about 2012, 2013. Still had my business, but now my kids are starting to get a little bit older, and so they didn't need me as much, and so I had more free time, and so I used most of my free time in my studio, which I set up in my basement, and another one in my garage. And back in the 90s, after graduating from Iowa, I had a studio for 10 years in Pilsen, and a big space about as big as this, in one of those old warehouse buildings. And so to go from that to now to a basement and doing my paintings next to the water heater was so I strung up some Christmas lights on the ceiling and put up a bunch of stuff on the walls and tried to make it as artsy or as inspiring as I could, and so it works. And so that's where I do most of my work. Larger paintings. I have a studio set up in the corner of my garage, next to a scaffold, next to all my big ladders, but it's sufficient space for me. We haven't parked cars in there since we moved in there, 15 years. So it's just where I keep all my stuff related to our business, contracting business, and then my studio for larger paintings. So I went back to making art 2013, and so what am I going to paint? What am I going to do? And so I just kind of followed my intuition and started doing paintings of my kids and my wife. And first watercolor, and then I went to oil, acrylic, and then oil. And so most of the subject matter was my family, things that were important to me. But I was in a stage, still in that stage, where I wanted to make something new, like try to reinvent the wheel. So, you get your MFA degree, okay, now I'm going to reinvent the wheel and I'm going to become a famous artist, okay. So a word of the wise, that just doesn't happen. So, to a very select few, but so I had to get more realistic. And what am I going to do? I'm going to paint my kids, paint my wife, paint my friends, but what sort of environment? I didn't want to just do portraiture. I didn't want to. I hadn't really fine-tuned my skills when it comes to portrait painting, and so that was the first order of business, was to relearn how to paint. So to unlearn how to pretend to be an artist and relearn how to be a real artist, basically. And so I did that, and just did lots of paintings, small paintings, sketch paintings, and just practicing, trying to get better. And I kind of rediscovered a few artists that I had gravitated to back in the 90s, and one of those artists was Odd Nerdrum, a Norwegian artist, a realist painter, but he incorporates into his work a lot of his own mythology that he's created. That's very subtle references to like Norse mythology, but it's really his own cosmology, if you want to call it that, of where he puts his figures into strange environments. And so I thought, okay, I really like the way he paints, so I started copying his paintings to learn how to use the paint, learn skills, and learn technique. And for me, technique is the use of skills. How do you use those skills? That's technique. But I didn't want to didn't want the paintings to look like Odd Nerdrum. And another big influence on me at that time was 10 years ago, 8 years ago, was Anselm Kiefer. I've always liked Anselm Kiefer and the use of materials and incorporating landscape, or the suggestion of landscape with the suggestion of figures. And but I wanted a little more realism than that, and I didn't want them to look like Anselm Kiefer. I didn't want to copy other artists or the work that I would present to the art community or to the world. I didn't want people to look at it and say, oh, that reminds me of so and so. The only reason why I did copies or master copies of Nerdrum and Rembrandt and different other artists is because I wanted to learn how they painted. So for me, realist painting, especially, realist painting going back to whenever to the present moment. There's two narratives going on. So there's the visual narrative that's presented by the content. So people in a place. So what's the narrative there? And then the other narrative is how it's made. So when I go to an art museum, I spend a little bit of time in, like the Art Institute, I'll spend a little bit of time in the modernist wing, but I spend most of my time going to the late 19th century paintings, Manet, Courbet, Constable, Turner especially. Turner's that one beautiful painting of that I can't remember the name of it, but of that boat that's in the water, kind of a stormy sky, a lot of waves. I just love that. Going to look at it and figure out, okay, how did this painter do this? How did this painter achieve achieve that appearance, or achieve those effects with the materials that they were using? And so that's the way I look at my painting. So I want to present something that has a visual narrative to it. So the figure, my kids, my daughter, in an environment, in a landscape or in an interior that narrates, has some kind of narrative to it that is significant to her or whoever that the subject matter is, something that's significant to them, that's relevant to them, and kind of tells their story a little bit. But then also the narrative involved in how it was made is for me is of equal importance. And so I went from a phase of my paintings, and none of them are here, a period of probably 4 years where I'm still learning, still kind of retraining myself to be an artist, where they looked like, it was obvious that they were inspired by Odd Nerdrum, with the horizon, the bent horizon, the sky, dark going to a lighter horizon at the bottom where it meets the landscape, and just this kind of otherworldly look to it. So I did a series of really large paintings like that, trying to create my own mythology, and it just wasn't working. And again, I'm falling into that artist trap of trying to reinvent the wheel or trying to reinvent something, and I said, screw it. So I'm just gonna be honest. I'm gonna paint about what I like and what's important to me, which is my family, my community of West Chicago, the people that are there, and the way that the painting is made, the way I approach painting, that narrative. And so having made that switch about 4 years ago, that's been my focus ever since. And then during COVID, that 2020, I painted a shitload of paintings. I mean, if I can say that, I painted a shitload of paintings because I had a shitload of time, like a lot of people. And so I hadn't done that much painting for years, probably not since graduate school. And so it really allowed me to, even though it was under tragic circumstances, that free time allowed me to really focus on what I wanted to do with painting and and it really solidified in my mind the importance of being, as an artist, being honest about your work, about what the origins are of the things that you bring in, the content that you bring into it. So if you're going to be borrowing from, let's say, a cultural sphere outside of my own, if I'm going to incorporate that into my work, I need to be honest about where that comes from. So like in West Chicago, the majority of our population is Latino, and most of those families come from Michoacan. And so a lot of my work, some of it incorporates that, elements of that, but anyway, so that's where I'm at this moment in my life, and I expect to continue doing the same thing, hopefully, for the next 30 years, see where it goes.